Hello, Terry Caliendo from Dedicated Managers here once again. I just talked about in the last few videos the abstraction that I've been doing. In the last one, I talked about getting that route cleaned up and getting that hard-coded stuff out of there. And so the next thing I wanted to start working on was nesting entities. And I don't even think I really nest entities yet, but what I needed to set up was setting up a button in the parent view to start adding a child entity. So if we take a look at the code here, and if we go into one of these clients here, this add child button is the next thing I'm adding. So I wanted to be in the, this is going to end up being the parent entity, which is going to have a nested entity of children. And they're going to have, more than one children. So we need to be able to add multiple children entities. So I need to start at this level, at the top level, add some children, which also happen to be child entities, so that gets a little confusing when I talk. But the parent, the primary caregiver, is going to have children. So I need this button to add a child, and I need to add that new entity and then relate that entity back to this primary caregiver. So that's what I'm starting to set up in this code. So if I take a look at this change, and let's start at the client level. So here you can see I'm at the client view, which is this view, the client view, and I'm looking at a particular client right now. So shoot, I keep going to the wrong one here. So that's just adding that button, and then when I click on that button, I call the add child function. So this is going to add a child, but now if I just call the add for the child functionality, I'm not passing any information about the parent, so that when the child adds the new entity, the child entity, it's not going to know which parent it's related to or which relative caregiver it's related to. So which entity type is its parent? Remember, the entity types are the collection IDs on the Firestore database. So real quick, I can show that again. This is the collection ID on the Firestore database. And so I'm just choosing collection ID there, but that's this, which child, I need to update these to actually match the database, and it'll be easy to understand. But child is ultimately going to end up being this related child entity, collection ID, or entity type, as I call them in my programming. So since this child needs to know what parent it's added to, which parent entity type it's added to, and what the ID of that parent entity is, that's what this is. So I created this global storage object. It shows up here in the store. That's this new sub-entity meta information. So when I'm adding a new sub-entity to a parent, I need some meta information about what I'm adding. So that's what I set up here. This sub-entity meta is actually a commit. So this is the actual variable, and the set new sub-entity meta is what actually sets that variable. So we don't want to set things directly on the store. We want to use the commits, which then allow our debugging tools to understand what's going on. So when I use commits, it allows this debugging tool to get updated with what's happening rather than being behind. And then it shows up here in the timeline as far as what changes are going on. So you can trace back and see, what's happened over the course of the timeline. So back to here. So I need to set that, and I need to give it the information that I talked about. So I need to tell it the ID of the parent and the type of the parent. So this is the collection ID, which is the, again, on here, the parent. So this is the child we're going to set. We're going to create a new child here with a bunch of information on that child, but we have to relate it back to the parent. So I need to know which parent, oops, cancel that. I need to know which parent it's related to and which type of collection it is, because there's going to be a bunch of different collections to choose from. So I need to know this guy is related to this guy, and so I put that information in this guy. I tell him who his parent is and which type is his parent. So, and then you can see that this is the RFR, primary relative caregiver, and this one's also RFR, primary relative caregiver. So these two guys are sharing a parent, which is fine. But that way I know as I click that add button to add children, each time I click this add button here, I'm calling functionality that relates what the new thing I'm created back to the parent. So that's what a lot of is going on in here. So back to that client view, yeah, I have to send. Where am I? Here's the store commit. I'm setting that new sub-entity meta information. I'm putting that out there. And then I'm going to call the child add. And so then I have to update my store for when I add the new child. And let's see, I don't think that's exactly showing up here. I guess this is the lines here. Let me take a break and look at this. So I'll actually go and find this because it's not exactly showing what's happening here, and I'm not that great with Get Kraken. So let's actually take a look at this. I'm going to check this branch out. So I'll copy the ID. It's hard to check out. Get Kraken doesn't give you a way to check out without creating a branch. I don't know why, but if I go back to the code and looks like I've got two instances running there. That's interesting. And I do a git checkout on that branch ID. And if I go and find that file, so I'll go and find, what file was it? We were looking at the client.view, the store actually, and we wanted to find that new entity meta stuff. So let's get back to the store. Here's the store. I'm in that checkout. So here's that new sub-entity meta. There's that mutation that just sets it. It just takes the replacement and then replaces it. And then this is another variable that I had to create to overcome an issue that I'll talk about in either soon or in another video. So then let's see what gets called. Let's go back to here, and we're calling store commit set new entity meta, and then we're adding the child. So if we look at creating a new entity, that's here. So the child, when it's loaded, it sends in on the created function, it dispatches get entity by container, and it sends in the child ID. So if I was to click this, it loads child/add, and so the variable that comes in for the ID is add. So that's the load there that loads what I just showed, and then that comes into this child.view as a prop from the router, which I've shown before, but it comes in as the child ID. And so I assign the doc ID, which is the next level in Firebase. These are the doc IDs. These here are doc IDs on the collection ID. So I have to give it the doc ID, which in this case is add, and I have special functionality when this is called if it says add or if it's an ID, because I know these IDs are always going to be long. It will never ever be ADD. So I can use that as a special case in my functionality of this thing to create a new one. So I send in that add, that property, that value of add to the doc ID, which means I don't have a doc ID yet. And the collection ID is the component collection ID, which is just a variable that I set in one place so I don't have to set it everywhere when I copy and paste the files. I talked about that before. So this is the component collection ID, or the entity type. So that's related child. So it sends in to this get entity by container. It sends in the child ID of add and the related child entity type. So when we go to the store and we look at this action, right? It's an action because it's going to dispatch some stuff. So what I'm sending in here is that information, and we can see that this is some other stuff I think I've talked about before, where I got to clear listeners in case there are any. I initialize the entity to a 0 object, and then here's the case where if it's add, the doc ID that I sent in is add. Well, I'm going to create a new one. So I need to dispatch to the Firestore, tell it to create that new entity. So if I go to the Firestore and I look for, let's highlight that, the fcommit, where is that function? That's here. And then basically this function looks for this function ultimately looks to see if there is an ID set on the collection. So that is, if we look at the viewX component, no, this is primary relative caregiver, but if I follow through with this child, with this child/add, once it's created, now I've got this related child entity, and it's got an ID field so that we know what the ID of that object is, because I'm not storing it in the data. This is the data that gets sent to Firebase. So right now I just created a new one. It's empty. That ID is what gets set once we're done, but that ID is not there when I first do that add functionality. So when it's child/add, we get into that functionality and this ID does not exist yet. So this is going to return false, which means we're going to come down here and create a new entity. So we'll create that new entity, and now this is where that new sub-entity stuff comes in from the client. So if I go back here and I look at the client, that's to relate, that's this that I was looking at here. Now if that's back here, that should be the same thing, right? Router push, store commit, new sub-entity meta, oops, child, that's why. So let's see. Nope. I was in the right place. It's here, add child. So this right here is what we were looking at here as part of this diff file in the client, where when the button's clicked, we we commit this information about what we're adding so that when we add the child, we know what information to add to it to tie it back to the current parent that we're on. So that's this here, which again is that new sub-entity meta stuff. So that's what's going to start happening in here, is I'm going to start looking for that. So I just set a local object to nothing here, so that in case it's a parent. So if it's a parent entity, we don't want to set any sub-entity information. If it's a parent setting a child to relate to itself, then we have a place to put it. So that's what happens here, is we determine and set the new information if there is a parent setting it. So that's what happened here, is we set that that information for the child to relate to. So that stuff is available, and so we're going to set new entity meta local to the information that's in there. So I'm going to reach out to the store. That's what context.state is. That's the storage. So I'm going to get that new sub-entity meta, which is, if I go back to the diff file, that's this variable up here in my initial properties section of the storage, which is the top of this file. I just don't want to scroll up and scroll back down. I get that value, but I do an object assign on it because I want to make a copy of it. I need this to be, because things are dispatched and they are asynchronous and not real time, I need to get that information as it was, so that when things happen, asynchronously, I can set this thing back for another change. I can reset it, but I keep that information in my local functionality that's happening here. So that's why I do this object assign, is just to make a copy of it that's not reactive or tied back to this original meta entity. So I make that copy, and then I go and I commit to that same place that I just submitted before, and I zero that out so that the next creation of any type of new entity will have that be a zero object, an empty object, so it won't try and add a parent to it if it doesn't need to. So that does that, and then that saves that state of what it was in this local object. So now I can go do this asynchronous call, and I send it the information, or I actually add this is the adding of that information. So that shows up in the Firestore, that property that I'm sending. Remember, I'm just sending an object, which is parent ID and parent type with some values, right? Well, that's the object that ultimately gets set here. And so when I look at the store, all I'm doing is when I create the new child, so if I do this child add and I hit enter there, I create this new child, which has this ID, and then if I go look in the store, these are all the children that I'm adding, it immediately ties that parent ID to this child that gets creative. So what did I just create? I created the K4E, the K4E, let's see, it should have that information. Let's see, let's set the first name and let's see if that shows up. So that's showing up there. Why didn't that show up yet? I'm going to have to pause this and figure this out. I figured it out. So remember, I clicked /child/add, but I didn't go through the primary caregiver. So that's going to call that child add functionality without setting, without doing this set first, because that's part of this functionality. All I'm doing is just calling this without setting this first, so that's why there's no ties. So it's creating it as a parent object as opposed to a child object. So really I need to go into a parent, a primary caregiver parent, and when I click add child to that parent, I get that add, and then it changes. And so now if I look at this Y21, the Y21, now that object is set on that object, so it knows its parents. So these I created without a parent, and these I created with a parent. Now that's a little bit of a potential bug that I'm allowing that to happen. At some point I'm going to need to protect that from happening if it's a child entity, not allow a child entity to be created without a parent, in case somebody copies that add link and just pastes it over and over again without going through the navigation to do it. But that's actually an interesting find of that bug. So, but anyway, you can I think it helps see that if you go just through the straight add, you won't get that, and if you go through the functionality that sets that, that's what this add, this is the button. Well, it's easier to see in the diff file of the client. Here's the button that I added, and when that's clicked, then I call that add child function and set this. So one way I was setting it, the other way I wasn't, and that's why one was a parent object and one was actually a child object. Now they show up in the same collection, this collection, because they are, I'm still just using that same functionality, because all I'm doing is just setting a value to tie it back. So really these can be used for this related child could tie back to anything. Ultimately, I'm probably not going to do that. I'm only going to have it tie back to one parent type, but I have created it dynamically enough that it can relate back to a bunch of different types. So let's take a look at where we are. Where are we at? I think we were in the store, so that created that new entity, and it used that that sub-entity information to tie it. And then when I get that back, so that it's going to get created on the store, and then Firebase is going to return this asynchronous functionality, which is when this call finishes, and it's going to be slow relative to immediate JavaScript code. It's going to then call this stuff. So that's when I will reinitialize the data in the object by going back to the store and going and getting that information. So that is, let's take a look here. The add just happened. It created those IDs on the store, but now we're still in the, if I can get back to it, we're still in this state. We're still in this state, so now we need to redirect and get back and get these values filled in, which they're going to be empty anyway, but we need to get that all tied up. And the easiest way to do that is just to go back and say, hey, same as I would from if I was calling a already created child object, child entity, let's go back and populate that. So I'm going to go back and populate it, and then I'm going to immediately replace that add path with the docref ID. And I talked about that in the last video about how I was doing that replace there. Rather than doing any complex functionality, I just take that /add that was here, that /add, and I replace it with the ID, and then I redirect to it. That will not call. So I'm going to redirect to that, which is going to end up calling this child again. That's not going to recall this created function. So I'm basically doing that because Vue reuses components that are already created. It's not going to run this created again. So I basically have to emulate that. And so before I call it, before I call that route, just do that functionality on my own and set that up. So that's going to do the same as it would if I was coming directly to the child by its ID. So if I go and find an old child with an ID and I go directly there, now I'm at that state where I'm just going to load that as is. So I'm out of this add functionality, and now I'm just into reloading everything as though it was the first time it loaded that page. So that's how I'm tying the child collections entities back to the parent, is by just doing that. So then in the next video, I'll end it there with a whopping 23 minutes. I'll end that there, and then we'll talk about how I started doing some of this other stuff and keep going to try and get through and get back up to date. So Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers. Again, hope you're enjoying this, or at least finding it interesting, or able to stay awake is probably even a bonus. So have a great day and happy coding.